Testing, testing, testing audio.
Yeah, one of the ones for today is talking about like you mentioned. Oh no, really? You waiting back there?
Okay. Can you hear me okay? I'll be louder than this, but just want to check. Great. Okay, I think we're ready to start. We have Victoria saying everybody is there, and we have our stream working. And we're in week 1, day 2. Holy crap, it already happened. You all still feel a little bit far away, but I'll try to manage. This is a really big room, and it's tough to lecture in my opinion. I have to really yell. How's everybody doing? How was yesterday? And oh, by the way, for Victoria, if I ask questions like how was something, I would appreciate a response in Slack. I'm monitoring Slack. Or if I say raise your hand, maybe use the hand emoji. So yes, how was yesterday? Yeah? Not feeling scared or overwhelmed or anything like that, I hope. But there's still time. I joke. We met briefly yesterday in the introductions, and I introduced myself very briefly, not really in any detail. So I'll go a little bit into my background, as you can see here on the screen. Not before I start a joke, though, because I'm told that in public speaking, you should start off with a joke to warm up the audience. So I try to make my jokes relevant to software development, potentially even to the week that you are in. In this case, it's a fundamentals week, right? So I'll keep it not too specific to something like a language or something. How many software developers does it take to screw on a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem. So that was it. That was my cheesy dad joke for the day. A little bit about myself. I forgot to mention yesterday that I am also a teacher, not just the head of education here. I was actually the original head instructor here when we started off in Vancouver 5 years ago. That is our main headquarters. And I moved from Toronto 5 years ago because I was done with the weather and other things there. Decided I wanted to move here and start fresh and start Lighthouse, actually. It was a goal that I had coming here. Couch surf for the first 3 months, I believe. And started it up with my other co-founders, with like 6 students, I think there were in the first cohort, out in Launch Academy, if you've been there in Vancouver, and sort of took it from there. And very quickly, actually, in our first year, I met Don Burks, who you've had a lecture with yesterday, the afternoon breakout, who's a fantastic instructor, way better than I am. So I already apologize for not being him right now here. Something I actually do, I start off with an apology with a lecture saying I'm a bit rusty because I used to lecture a lot, but now I don't. I have maybe once or twice a week. And so I'm a little bit rustier than I used to be. So going a little bit over time, going a little bit slower, saying more ums than I'd like to. So I apologize in advance. Also not knowing your names yet, and potentially not even knowing your names, all of your names at least, in the next few weeks because I don't spend enough time with students as much as I used to. So apologies for all of that. My formal background is in computer science, programming. So I was lucky enough at a very young age to be exposed to computers, thanks to my parents. I actually started teaching other people how to use MS-DOS and word processing back where I grew up in Pakistan. At the age of 10, I think I started volunteering and teaching people how to do that stuff. And didn't realize, I mean, I wasn't doing programming at the time, but I started realizing kind of later on in life that I started really appreciating teaching and mentoring and coaching people, to the point where, like, in high school, I was actually like co-creating the computer science curriculum with the teacher. I was that keener that sat in front of class and annoyed the hell out of everybody else in computer science class, but sucked at like all the other subjects, you know, specifically math. Oh my God. But really, really enjoyed computer science. So I really knew I wanted to get into computer science in university. TA'd there as well. Quickly started, you know, teaching, and always knew I was going to get into teaching. But I always saw it as like I would do that later in my career, as like maybe in my 60s or 50s or something like that, as like the tail end of my career, just to impart that knowledge that I've secured at the beginning of my career. But as fate would have it, boot camps were introduced to me, and I thought that was amazing. Instead of trying to teach and try to change college education or university education from within, trying to change something that's, you know, quite set and institutionalized, why not take this approach, which ended up being a lot better in terms of being able to do something different, do something progressive. So that's my background. I do believe that university is a track for people. I'm not of the opinion, as the founder of a boot camp, that, you know, they're better than universities or colleges. I think they have a purpose. They're a different track for people who potentially already have a degree, for example, such as I'm guessing some of you have. And I don't regret doing a computer science degree, which took me a lot longer than what it's taking you to get to the point that I got to after I graduated university. Right after I graduated university, 4 years was my program. I had a few co-op like internships, which really inspired some of the stuff that we do here with the internship model after you graduate. So I was lucky in that I had that. And I used maybe 20% of what I learned in university, like in terms of programming, as a web developer that, you know, graduated university as a junior web dev. You'll see me constantly kind of just checking in on Victoria. And 80% of it was like theoretical knowledge that truthfully will be gaps for you that you won't necessarily get here, right? Like the underlying kind of concepts. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. But I don't think that like those 4 years were a waste, given where I was in life, how young I was. I do personally believe that like university and college is a good track. Maybe a partial regret is that I didn't do something else other than computer science, because I could have probably gotten into the field myself without that education, given the mindset of our industry and given what's kind of expected of you. Maybe done something like, you know, something else, physics or astronomy or something like that. I did minor in philosophy, so maybe I could have majored in that. Just to make someone, I feel like I'm not as holistic as some people that I see graduate from Lighthouse. You know, they have a background in finance or psychology or law or something else, whereas mine has been computers throughout. So I kind of envy the students that we have in a way, because they come with potentially a different background than computers, and then they're marrying their understanding and appreciation of technology and programming, like being makers, by going to a boot camp like ours. So I think it's pretty cool that you guys are doing what you're doing, and I'm jealous, is what I'm saying. This is your first like morning lecture that's not just introductions, right? I know you had an afternoon breakout with Dawn, which was technically a technical lecture, but I wanted to do a little bit of expectation setting and at least tell you about my philosophies of lectures here at Lighthouse, and kind of make some suggestions about how to get most value out of them. I tend to, at least for my lectures, be as interactive as possible, and not just talk like I've been talking for the last 10 minutes, but actually get you guys to do a little bit of talking too. And for the satellite cohort, that means typing stuff out, and for me to actually be toggling. But it would actually also be really nice if I could get a volunteer or two from your cohort here in Vancouver to help monitor the Victoria channel. Not just for my lectures, but for future lectures. It's really cool to be able to have like a proxy who's like sitting in the audience being like, hey, you didn't switch to the Slack channel, but there's a question. Let me ask on behalf of a student over there. I'd really appreciate that. Does anybody want to raise their hand and volunteer for something like that? Yes? Sorry, your name? Aaron? Yeah, that'd be great. But that means you need your laptop. So you okay with that? Thanks. And I'll let you know what the channel is. Yeah, it's the same, except it'll say Vic in the name. Yeah, sweet. And hopefully Victoria's doing all right so far. Gonna make me click on the reply. Lectures. Before we get into the actual technical aspect of the lecture, which I promise we will, I'm going to talk a little bit about lectures here. What do you guys feel, before I talk about my philosophy, are like the biggest advantages that you could see? I know you've only had one in the afternoon yesterday, as the advantage of lectures of how we do them here so far, and how you'd like to take advantage of them. Like, what do you think are their strengths and weaknesses? Yeah.
I like the flip model because it just gives us a chance to sort of ask more informed questions. You know, we've had a chance to digest some things, and we haven't really gotten into it too much because it was the first lecture yesterday, but we still, you know, it's nice to kind of go over, like,
Yeah,
okay,
the flipped model where it wasn't like, hey, introduction to Git. It was like, you've been using Git, let us tell you more about it, right?
Yeah, so it's like we can do the front end loading ourselves by reading an article and then bounce ideas off of it.
That's a really, really good point. One of the things I say right off the bat about lectures is I think, and I'm pretty sure research has confirmed this, so it's not just I think, lectures are terrible at imparting new knowledge. They're absolutely, like there's, you know, if I quizzed everybody right after a lecture on any new topic that I introduced here, I would not expect great results. So we fall into the trap a little bit. It's hard because we're a condensed model and we're introducing new things every day. So how do you know, it's tough to do the flipped thing that you've described. Hopefully you'll notice that more and more. But there'll be days where lectures will introduce a new topic. But what's nice in our model is that there's the lab piece right after. That's a big chunk of your day. So you still have that flipped feeling. Yeah. Oh. Oh, yes, absolutely. I thought I did repeat. You could do that, but I thought I did by saying flip model, but I wanted to paraphrase. I wouldn't be able to repeat everything you said, but I do try to make an intentional effort to repeat answers for what it's worth. But let me know if I'm doing a poor job, Victoria. What else? I mentioned a weakness as part of what you said around the flip model, the weakness being imparting new knowledge, right? Like teaching a new concept. So what is something that you think like would be more of the strength from lectures? So interact, you're saying interact with interaction. Interaction and a good mental break from whatever you're doing, absolutely. There's something more in the interaction piece that I'm looking for. Yep.
Like hearing different questions other people might have that you might not even thought to ask.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So actually being in a, so you're kind of hinting, you didn't use the word, but you're kind of hinting about, maybe you did use the word, collaboration. Right, collaboration through seeing other people's questions, collaboration through seeing other people's approach to solving a problem, which we'll do today. You'll see my approach as well as your classmates' approach to solving problems, so we'll be discussing a problem together. Collaboration, lots of hands going up. Anything from Victoria yet in terms of answers? No. Not yet? Yep, hi.
Standard practices, learning what industry standards we do, because there's a lot of opinions out there online.
Yeah, okay, so here's an answer. Standard practices and what will be standard. I would argue that our entire curriculum, you know, not just the lectures, should be doing a good job of that. So how does the lecture separate from what you're already learning as standard good practices from the content that beyond the lectures?
I guess could you guys kind of pinpoint, like you think about some of the good practices we're doing, I mean, that's in terms of recipes and so this is how this is different than this is, you know, this is don't do this, don't, you know, so maybe pinpointing and touching on a few.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And you touched on something else, which is it allows us to be pretty agile with like curriculum things that are maybe not in the curriculum. You know, Don maybe has an opinion on something that is not really mentioned in the curriculum, and so he lectures his opportunity to like augment the curriculum as well, right? And what's really nice, and this is more of a feature of not lectures, but how we do lectures with so many different instructors. For example, you've had Don yesterday, you had me today, and then in the afternoon you'll have Nima sitting over there. And then tomorrow, I don't know, but you'll have a bunch of different instructors even just in your first week. And what's the advantage of that? There's also a disadvantage, but what is the advantage of that? Yeah, different perspectives, right? Yeah, different perspectives and opinions. You know, there's something we also warn you about with regards to so many mentors that we have in the space. I think Vancouver has like, I don't know the exact number, but approximately 30 active part-time people that you'll have to get there know their names, right, to build that relationship. As opposed to just a few. Some boot camps will just have a few core teachers that are assigned to a cohort, maybe 2 instructors, and those will be your mentors and instructors in that boot camp. We took a very different approach, right? I call it community-driven education, where we bring in a whole bunch of people from the community who are developers first and mentors, coaches second. Like I look for that making passion actually first, right? And they're active. They're working in the community, and then they're also passionate about coaching and teaching like I was describing that I was at a young age, right? That allows you to have different perspectives, and also people that are active in the community that are actually devs and not just people who can talk the talk but not walk the walk. Do you know what I mean? There's still some stuff we haven't hit on, which I was hoping we would have by now, around lectures. So do some digging. We talked about how there's collaboration. Knowledge isn't the best. So then how should I be approaching lecture then? If I'm not imparting new knowledge in terms of new concepts, let's call them, what should I be focusing on? Well, lots of answers. This is a really keen chord. I love this. Yeah, in the back. Yeah, keyboard shortcuts in Sublime yesterday. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, to paraphrase, or at least to put it in my words, the overarching goal is to set you up for success. The lecture's goal is maybe to set you up for success in the short term, like today or this week, right? And we already know that we talked about the knowledge piece and the concepts piece. So how do I set you up for success for today or for this week? I think it should really be, if there's a senior dev up in front of the class, it should be about demonstration. It should be about like, watch how we solve problems together, right? So I think it's more demonstration. It's more actually inspiration as well, inspired for the day. Get you energized is another objective of the lecture, in my opinion. And as part of that, like entertainment, the lecture has to be engaging and entertaining to get you energized. But I think the core thing is to get you to really like see developers solve problems with you, right? That pair programming approach is also something I try to do in lectures, especially in the first 2 weeks, where we actually collaboratively will solve a problem today in the morning. And hopefully, I think the breakouts are around the same kind of concept. So that's a good discussion. Does anybody want to add anything that you think I missed or disagree with what I'm saying? Because I think these are all opinions. Yeah?
Gabe inspired to review and expand on topics and give hands-on examples.
Absolutely. So that's a really, really good point from Gabe, to review concepts and give kind of hands-on examples on how to solve them, potentially in different ways. Absolutely. That's good. Anybody else want to add anything about lectures or their opinion or experience with lectures or a story? I'm okay with anything. We got time. I'm going to go, oh, that's the other thing. I'm going to talk about my approach to lectures a little bit right after this. But before we park the philosophy of lectures in general, anybody want to disagree? By the way, I'm very happy to like hear the disagreement. We don't have to get into an argument. Yeah?
I kind of like spontaneous learning lectures too, even though I know it's not the best like pedagogy, but I really, like I went to university for literature and history, and I love lectures.
Mm-hmm.
Like the instructors of knowledge. I've got a bunch of really interesting ideas to impart, and it was like reading a book but without having to read, you could ask questions, you know?
Right.
So I really enjoyed
What's your name?
Shmoo.
Shmoo, right. So Shmoo was saying that, you know, despite knowing that it's not necessarily the best practice, and I agree with you, like, I am personally of the belief that no extreme is good. So in the same way, like, the extreme of, like, don't do new knowledge in lectures, new concept, I don't really like that. Maybe that's why we don't follow that extreme, or maybe because you kind of have to do that. But ultimately, sometimes you have really good teachers, and you get really inspired, and as long as you're getting inspired and seeing, you know, how excited they are about that topic, that's kind of a big objective in my opinion. It seems kind of counterintuitive, and it seems kind of sounds like I'm belittling lectures to make them sound like entertainers, but I think that's part of getting everybody else excited about that topic as well. I don't know if that's exactly what you were speaking to.
A good instructor will have very engaging classes.
Mm-hmm.
A boring instructor will hard to stay focused.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think lectures are for everybody either. That's something I also wanted to say. So some instructors get really offended if, for example, I ask a question, I'll be like, what do you think? You know, I don't know your name, but I'll point, right? Aiden? Say it again. Aiden. I went to the doctor's yesterday to get my ears checked. And he was like, you need to come back and we need to get that wax cleared out. I thought I'd tell you a gross story about myself. So yeah, I think I have hearing problems. But anyway, Aiden. So if I point at Aiden and say, hey, and you're like, can you repeat the question? I was completely zoned out. You know, this happens. I personally believe that an hour and a half, 2-hour lecture, like I know, even despite a very engaging instructor, they could say something that just triggers a memory. And all of a sudden I'm distracted and I zone out a lot. So for me, I don't hold it against you if you're like, can you repeat the question? I was totally not paying attention. That is, for me, with me at least, you can be totally honest about that. It's my job to keep you engaged, and also we're all humans, and it's okay to just be honest about where we're at with the context of everything, right? So I don't expect full engagement, and it's my responsibility to try and get that out of you, not your responsibility. It is obviously partly your responsibility, but I don't take it personally if that's not going to happen. Is that okay? I also like to take long pauses during lecture. So you'll see me like ask a question or just like do something on the screen, which you'll see it today, and then I'll just like pause without even prompting anything, and I'll just take a sip of my coffee or water, whatever I have in front of me, and I'll do an awkward pause. And I like to call myself the champion of awkward pauses or awkward moments, because I want to give you guys enough chance to like interrupt and ask questions or throw an idea out there or whatever it may be. Because one of my pet peeves in university when I had instructors was they'd say, any questions? And they'd pause for like 3 seconds or less and move on. And I didn't even have time to work up the courage or think about a question or formulate the question in the right way before they moved on. And then it was kind of not really fair in my opinion. So I try to do that as much as possible. Also allows me to think about what I'm saying next, right? So I think it's a good kind of take things slow. That's the other thing, by the way. You'll see that in Compass there's objectives for lectures when you click on that lecture item. And also there's previous lecture recordings, which we enabled about 6 months ago. Pretty cool. Before they were only visible to teachers. But we said, why not let students see them too? Right? We don't expect you to watch those lecture recordings before the morning, right? There's a 2-hour lecture recording. They're not meant to be, they were meant for a live audience. So they're not the most ideal to watch. They can be, but they're not the most ideal to watch live, to watch on demand, right? But the notes talk about the objectives for the lecture. I don't always achieve all of those outcomes. My goal, again, is very much focused on the approach. Not the approach of lecture, by the way. But this is one of the things I want to talk about my style. My lectures tend to focus very much on what I think is the most important thing to take away from boot camp. So I'm going to ask you that next. What do you think are some of the most important things to take away from boot camp? From a boot camp like this, not just any boot camp, you know, physical workout boot camp will have very different outcomes that they're trying to achieve. What do you think for something like Lighthouse, this program here? What are the key outcomes that we're looking for? Name? Peter. Peter, what do you think?
How to learn something new that you're not familiar with, and how challenge yourself.
Yeah, how to learn something new that you're unfamiliar with. And we'll add kind of our context here, because learning to learn is a very generic statement that every school makes, right? Universities are good at teaching you how to learn too. But it's all about like domain specific. Because yes, there's the overlying kind of abstract learning to learn mindset, the growth mindset that we talked about. But then there's also the like domain specific learning to learn skill, right? Like how do you learn to learn in tech when it comes to making things? Different than learning to learn in maybe, I don't know, something like the arts, you know? Yeah.
So what I thought of is basically I want to know how to problem solve without having to in your head. Like not have a question and be able to figure it out without asking them to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if I totally agree with the without asking for too much help. But yeah, definitely getting towards independence.
Yeah.
But I mean, I ask for help all the time, right?
In the job, in the job or whatnot, you don't have to do something to figure it out. Or be able to do that without
Yeah, absolutely. So becoming more and more independent. The learning to learn kind of ties in with that, of course, in terms of problem solving. So definitely that is a big focus of mine in terms of lecture, is not so much a new concept, but how do you learn that concept, pretending that, in my case, pretending that you don't know that concept. Right? Yep.
Yeah, that's sort of what you just said sort of leads to my thought, which was that one of the things we're learning is how to help one another without just giving the answer.
And hopefully you've had mentor experience yesterday where you didn't get answers from mentors. Hopefully that happened. You got guidance in terms of how to approach getting the answer. That's something we coach our mentors on doing, right? And so that hopefully speaks to what you just said, which is how to help each other, even peers, without giving answers out. Yeah, absolutely. How to articulate. This is actually huge. I don't focus on this enough probably, so I appreciate that angle. How to articulate yourself enough to get answers or get unstuck, to get to the next step, right? So these are all good abstract answers. How does it apply to my approach? I believe in, when you're working on problem solving, to, of course, articulate, of course, one of the goals is, of course, to get further and further, right? But my belief is, Don yesterday talked about red and green, like good versus error or bad. It's a common kind of thing that we're used to in society. And another thing we're used to in society, how we've been trained from like early childhood, is if we see red or error, we're told that's bad. We did something wrong. Is that a fair statement? Right, so we get immediately, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, we get anxious when we see an error message. I'm sure that when you were working on code yesterday, you saw errors and it made you kind of go, oh, like what is wrong with, like, why am I not getting this? You know, you think that as a failure, a micro failure. And I want to actually train that out of you. I believe in something called error-driven development. It's not a thing that you can Google. It doesn't exist as a term, I don't think. But the idea is to work incrementally on solving that problem that you're trying to solve by causing errors deliberately and actually championing those errors and using them to your advantage. So actually this lecture, maybe even the following lecture that I have with you this week, will really try to show that approach of working incrementally towards solving in this case, it'll be a simple problem that you'll be comfortable solving, I think, but really taking a different approach than what you probably took yesterday or through the prep course. So I want to introduce a new approach that I don't think is actually even introduced or taught well in our curriculum. So this is me doing the thing where I'm like doing micro adjustments to how we teach to see how it's received. And I've been taking this error-driven development approach in lecture for the last 6 months to see how well it's received. And so far the results are really good. So I'm going to be continuing down that path and kind of talking to that a little bit more here in lecture. So incremental development using errors, so error-driven development. So incrementally working and causing errors deliberately. Okay, that is going to be a focus of mine in this lecture. What do you think the steps are going to be then if I'm solving a given problem? What are the abstract steps I'm going to do? What's the first thing I'm going to do? Break the problem down into small chunks. Of course, working incrementally is a big part of that, right? So one of the approaches that I think was introduced on day one as a way of solving problems is actually not that. It's pseudocode, right? Did you read that exercise around, here's an example. Did you guys enjoy that reading or that exercise? Where it like shows you the logic of breaking down that algorithm into non-code and then writing the code from it. That is one approach to solving those kind of word problems, right? That's the like, let me try and understand how I would do the logic for this. I think that is a good approach. But that's actually, in a way, counter to working incrementally. So I think that is an approach you should take and try to take. But then as you actually implement the JavaScript for that, instead of being like, this is the English that I wrote, this is the logic that I wrote, let me just go ahead and type it all out, I think you do that incrementally in small steps. So that's the steps I'm talking about, is actually implementing that pseudocode. Yeah.
I think the very first step would be to really define the problem, right? Because instructions said that as well. But, I met this in a lot of the assignments in the prep course, where the problem wasn't very clearly articulated. And I must have read the instructions for some of those things like a dozen times of finding clues of what I'm supposed to software, and often I'd get started and I'd hit a point where I couldn't go any further, and I'd go back and reread it and realize that I was
misinterpreting the problem.
because I have the
So that's good to know, good feedback as well. So defining the problem as well as possible, both so that either it's not well explained or explained well, but you misread or whatever it may be, to really like revisit the problem over and over again. And obviously at the beginning as well to define that problem. Totally agree. It's not what I had in mind for the first, but it obviously makes the most sense. Yep.
Another thing I took out of that meeting was figuring out what your inputs are right away and writing them down. So then therefore you start your base and what you need to work with. And that, because at first I had no idea what my inputs were, and then they broke it down for me. I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. And then I knew how to work around it.
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding what the actual parameters are going into the thing that the software that you're writing is really important as well. Because software is really two things. Software is data, information, and behavior around that data. Right? And if you look at what you just said here, both the behavior and what it ought to be doing, the problem, and then partly the data as well in terms of what's the data I'm getting in before I can manipulate that data further, right? Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Clive?
Something that I find really useful is when I might have an immediate like, oh, okay, this is I think how we're gonna solve it. So I might quickly write a rough thing, and then there's tons of console logs around, so I can see is it actually spitting output what I wanted those different stages.
Yeah.
I don't care if it looks ugly, the output looks ugly, but is it actually iterating the way I want it to be iterating? Then I can get rid of console log everything.
Absolutely. Like having those like quick tricks like console log, as you said, to like put them everywhere as you're working through, not just at the end. As on each step you're saying you put console log statements, and that's something I really strongly encourage, and you'll see me doing as well. So that's already a tip in terms of when I ask questions about what's next. It's probably console log or something of that nature in terms of the next step. Yes.
I also found that looking at the example output or just articulating what the output of the program should look like, and then figuring out the logic helps you a lot. So if you have to revert this thing, this is how the input is going to look, this is how the output looks.
So yeah, not only looking at the inputs, but what is and that's the defining the problem as well, like what are the outputs, but more specifically, we can put that as a separate statement. What is the intended output at the end? Yeah, absolutely. And then also just forgot to write Clive's thing, which was, write code that will, I'll say it differently instead of just console log, write code that will test the behavior. Right, at that step, whether it's a console log or something else. Console log makes sense because right now we're always in the terminal, but soon we'll be writing apps that will display things on the web page, so console log is going to be slightly differently used, right? You won't use console log, you'll use something else. Anything else anybody wants to add? The question is, the question from, sorry, your name again? Aiden. Yeah, so the question is around breakpoints, where you can actually like select a line of code and say, run until this code, and then like pause here so I can see the values. A lot of programs a lot of programmers use this kind of step-by-step debugging as a tool to help them debug. I personally don't use that as much, but I do know that it exists. So Node does have a debugger built in. I think the command is debugger. You actually type in, like in a line of code as you're typing in, you type in debugger, like that. And when you run Node, I forget because I don't use this very often, but there's a way you can Google that, and there's a way to like use that to your advantage. You won't see me demonstrating, yeah, absolutely. You won't see me demonstrating debugger at all ever in lecture just because of personal style, not something I'm comfortable doing. I used to do that when I was a Java dev, but then as soon as I transitioned to Ruby and JavaScript, I don't know, directly or indirectly dropped that skill. I think in certain cases it's a very valuable thing, but I think in week one you could probably, and even for the entire bootcamp, you probably don't need to use this if you're using what Clive was talking about, which is just the console log stripe strategies. But it's a preference thing versus a dogmatic thing. You know what I mean? Any other questions or comments about everything we've talked about? Yeah, in the back, sorry, name? Tony. Yeah, really good point. At what point are you like revisiting the code that you've written to see if it's the right way to solve that problem? Because you've already potentially written like the test, like console log, some output. So if you change the internals, it's not going to hopefully be too harmful, or it'll be pretty easy for you to tell if it's not working as you try to improve the code that you've written. Maybe organize it better, make it cleaner, change some variable names, simple stuff like that, right? Refactor the code that you wrote earlier to improve as you go, so you don't have a whole bunch of like cleanup to do at the end, right? Cleanup of code or refactoring of code that's like large amounts is actually one of the harder things to do. Senior developers struggle with changing existing code, period, whether it's refactoring or enhancing a piece of a program. Refactoring meaning you're not changing its behavior, but really just the internal implementation so that it's cleaner or nicer, better maintained, better written. Whereas if you take it further by adding a new feature or something, that's not refactoring, that's enhancing or something. But either of those two things, because it's existing code, is very hard. That's a very different skill set. That will take time for you to develop. You won't get good at that in week 1, in my opinion, right? We'll throw a little bit of that at you, but not too much, because it can get overwhelming even for experienced developers. Yeah.
So the question is, kind of in the real world, if you're working at some company, you're really like pushing out code really fast, and certain programs, that we're writing, and we're moving on to the next one, but we're not spending a ton of time kind of doing and mulling over and kind of refactor. Do you do that in the?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So week 1 has that kind of necessary evil of being too many or more of the small exercises that don't give you that like opportunity to dive in and kind of see, well, why am I doing this as much, or how can I do this better or refactor it, and things of that nature. Exactly for the reason I just said, partly, and partly because it's a fundamentals week, similar to your prep course, and because we need to lay some of those foundations that are going to go a lot faster than the prep and a lot deeper than the prep before you start doing projects, which start next week. So next week, as Don mentioned in his curriculum overview, you'll start working on like Tiny App, which is a project that lasts like 4 to 5 days, right? And that's going to be a web application that you're building, and so you'll go a lot deeper, and you'll have opportunity to even be creative in that, versus right now there's less room for that, right? Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing is thinking about and writing a plan for handling edge cases. What are edge cases? What are edge cases? I mean, these are kind of very like industry-specific terms sometimes, and I also catch myself using them, thinking people know what they mean, but they don't. People don't always know what they mean. Yeah.
It's like drawing a boundary where you would expect people to be doing. Like for example, if you're testing like a summary string, you wouldn't expect that if you're saying you would add in all positive numbers, but it would have to be added negative numbers or something like that.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. So things that are, and the way I like to say it is things that are not in the happy path. So the happy path is the opposite of edge cases, where it's like the stuff that like is already defined in the problem, maybe examples that are given in the problem definition, where things are happy, like it's how it's supposed to work. But then what about things, you're getting data as input, and they're probably coming from a human. What happens if the data is in not the state that you expected, right? So it's kind of like, what is the, where is the boundary of like what kind of things you're going to handle and how? Edge cases might be exactly this example used here, where like if we're summing a bunch of numbers, what about negative numbers? What about if there's no numbers? What about if I give you ABC as one of the numbers? Things of that nature should be also handled, or at least deliberately handled. It may still throw an error, but it should be a deliberate decision by the developer, right? Versus, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Which is the point we're trying to make here, is you should ideally try to avoid the, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Quality assurance, yeah. That's a really good point. Quality assurance individuals definitely have to think about that all the time, But one of the things I see, especially early developers like yourself do, is make the mistake of thinking that that's their job and your job is to maybe implement more of a happy path type situation. And I definitely see a difference between developers who have the QA, quality assurance mindset, because I believe, versus ones that don't. And I think the former are way more appealing to me if I were hiring devs. Right? I want you to be writing and thinking about the edge cases, not somebody catching that and then the thing that you implemented coming back onto your plate or somebody else's plate because you didn't think about these edge cases. Right? It's also more fun. It's also more interesting to think about those edge cases than just the happy path. Right? I'll be doing less of the edge case stuff in this lecture, just interest of time, but you'll see more and more of that kind of throughout the program. For example, Tiny App, it's a great example. We do this deliberately, and sometimes we get feedback from students going, hey, what the hell? We specifically give you instructions on what to implement for Tiny App, and then when it comes for us, time for us to evaluate the project, and we give you like our checklist of what how we're gonna evaluate this project, which happens over the weekend, which you could pass or fail, and then if you fail, you have to fix it and submit it again, just like you would at your job. In that checklist are things that we didn't ask you to implement. Like, what happens if the user does this? And then people go, well, you didn't ask me to particularly solve that path, but we also expected you to think about those kind of things. Right? So we don't give you all of the edge cases that you're supposed to implement. We expect you to have handled them, but we do remind you, hey, before you submit, here are some edge cases that we are going to look for. Right?
That was my question. Do we get that list before we submit it?
Yeah, you get that list. In an ideal world, I wouldn't even give you that list, but I mean, you're still in training mode for your first project. Yeah, absolutely. But it's still kind of like on Friday you're getting, or Thursday or Friday you're getting a list. You're like, oh, now I need to like go fix these things. But hey, lesson learned, right? Cool, that's a lot of me talking still. I'm not really that, again, something I try to avoid. And we're gonna get, for the latter part of this lecture, problem solving. So I'm gonna define the problem that we're gonna solve. Some of you may roll your eyes and go, that's easy. Some of you may not. Again, it's not about getting to the solution. It is gonna be about the approach. Okay, that's what this lecture is specifically focused on, but generally my lecture is always focused on. So the problem for our live coding exercise, and we're going to use it to narrate how to approach problem solving, right? The emphasis will be on incremental development using error-driven development. So we're going to write a node program, a command line program, that takes in an unlimited set of numbers passed in through the command line, so command line arguments, and just prints out the sum of them. Somebody already used sum as an example, right? So keeping it as trivial as possible, just to demonstrate this approach of error-driven development. So you've solved something similar to this, I think, summing two numbers from the command line. So this should already be relatable, right? So we're going to take a quick break, 5 minutes, bio break, and then in that time you can think about this, but not the solution. Think about, the question I'm going to ask is, what do I do first? And I'm telling you right now it's a trick question, because I want you to think in terms of errors. So what do you think I'm going to really push for when I ask, what do we do as the first thing? Is the thing I want you to think about during the break, and then that's the first question I'll ask when we start working on this. Cool beans? Okay, see you in 5 minutes. Cheers. So I think everybody's back here in Vancouver. Hopefully everybody's back. And we can resume this. How are you feeling energy-wise?
Great.
Yeah? Despite the non-technical nature of the first half, I'm glad to see most people are still awake. Yeah? Is that a, yeah? Okay. Cool. So we know what the problem is. I'll read it out again. We write a program that takes in through command line arguments a set of numbers, any unlimited set of numbers, one to many, and prints out the sum of them. Okay? So I have the file here called sum.js, which kind of reminds us what the problem is. I'll just copy that to my clipboard. And actually what I'm going to do is just start really from scratch and delete that file. So I have nothing, right? I've been given a new assignment. I know it's kind of a small assignment, just like week 1 style, but it is what it is. Close that file. When you delete a file that is opened by your editor, you know, it kind of gets confused, right? And then like you could like resave the file, which just happened with me, or just close that tab, but it will be like, there are changes here. And if you say, yes, I want to save them, it will actually create that file again and save it. So just be aware of that. It's a gotcha. What is my first step to incrementally solving this problem? And there's no right answer here. I am going to show you my approach and kind of focus on that a little bit, but I do want to hear other approaches. Just so you know, I'm not averse to other approaches. I just want to focus on a specific one, but I'm happy to hear other approaches. Yeah? We want to make sure that the input is valid.
Yeah, if we're adding numbers, we need numbers that are inputted. If they're not numbers,
Yep, so you're thinking about edge cases in terms of not just numbers. I would argue that you don't think about them yet. There's obviously like too late and too early. Not obviously, but there is that concept in my mind, and so I think this would be too early. Yeah. Others? Yep. Choose the right language. What do you mean? Absolutely. I wasn't even thinking that far, but that's a really, really good point to make. How are you solving the problem? What language and tools are you going to use? In this case, it's specifically asking me to write a Node program, so it's already defined that I'm going to be using Node and therefore JavaScript. But it's a fair statement. As you become more and more of a holistic professional developer who can write, a polyglot developer who can write in many different languages, and that's something we focus on even by the end of this program is 2 different languages, right? Like JavaScript and Ruby, specifically so you have options. Then yeah, you'll be asking that question more, which is what tool is the best job? Like what language, what framework, things like that. Very good point, yep. So your mind is kind of jumping to, I need a loop, right? Because I'm going to be looping through a bunch of numbers in order to sum them. But how do I manifest that as my first step? Do I just go ahead and write a loop? Because remember, think about my philosophy, which is error-driven development, right? So as much as possible, I want to work small steps. And actually, before writing code, I want to cause errors. And then solve those errors incrementally as the next step. So create an error. And this is something I didn't do a good job of writing out up here. As I took your answers, here's the incremental approach that I'm talking about. Create an error, actually. Solve that error and just that error. And then, I forget who it was who pointed out refactoring. See if you want to improve that solution. Just that particular solution so far, or so far what you've written so far. Is that like a next thing you want to do is refactor? And then repeat. That is my incremental error-driven development approach that I want to kind of focus on for the rest of this lecture, and hopefully for you to try today and onwards. So I saw some hands up, but with that said, maybe your answers change a little bit, I don't know. What do you think as a first step?
Figure out how to capture the input into your program. So,
What program? What program are you talking about? I don't have a program. Capture the input into my program, but I literally don't have a file. So what is my first step? So that was my trick question. The answer is not create a file. The answer, at least in the dogmatic error-driven development approach, is cause the error. So the error is actually going to be pretend the file is there and try to run the file. Like that's how granular I'm getting, at least in this lecture, to make that point. And maybe that's what you should be doing just to kind of practice that a little bit until you get comfortable with that step and you don't need to test out what it's like to not have the file. So my very first step is actually, I'm going to need a file, let's call it some.js. But instead of touching that file, I would argue that the error-driven development approach is try to run that file. Experience the error, right? What is it like when you try to run a file that doesn't exist? Maybe you've never encountered that by accident. This will give you that opportunity to do that. So node space file. Now, of course, it assumes that you know how to run a file. So there's that background research that you have or knowledge that I'm assuming that you have to be able to run a file, right? I'm not going to go that granular in terms of how do you learn to do that. So far, so good? What do I expect now? So, oh, that's the other thing I forgot to mention. Not just create an error. Have a hypothesis of the error. So you're going to be deliberately creating errors, right? So always have a hypothesis about what will happen. So you want to take that scientific approach. Not only about that, but then here, before you run it, hypothesize the change in behavior, run and confirm, deny hypothesis. So there's like that kind of scientific approach kind of baked in there as well. So with that said, I should have an hypothesis of this error. What do I think this will do? Module not found is what you're saying? Or file not found, if I didn't know specifically about node's error message, would be an acceptable answer. That wouldn't be wrong. It can't find the file. So the error message will, I don't need the exact phrase, but it will complain about the file not being there, would be my hypothesis, in some way. And then maybe I don't know that it's going to say module not found, because what the hell, it's a file. What the hell does it mean by module, right? And that's my opportunity to potentially learn something unique about that environment, node in this case, to say, why is it talking about modules? Maybe I want to take a digression here and actually Google this error if I have the luxury and find out why is it this error message and not can't find file. What is a module in JavaScript? That might be a rabbit hole to go down, right, for this week or for right now. But just so you know, these are the opportunities and doors that open up when you cause errors deliberately and you feel more in control of the error that's happening. That's not always going to be the case. Errors will happen a lot when you don't intend for them, but deliberately causing them gives you that confidence to be able to deal with them and not see them as a problem, but as a challenge, as part of making, right? That whole attitude towards making means causing errors, right? Which will take time to master. So we've created the error. We're going to have to solve that error. So this one's an easy one, right? I'm going to have to create a file in order for that error to go away. So that'll be touch some.js, right? That's the file I'm trying to create. I could go in there and right-click. Again, a goal of lecture is demonstration. I'm purposefully demonstrating certain things, even subconsciously to you, that you may or may not be taking note of, that were talked about yesterday, right? We try to build up on things. So like, for example, you see me switching windows. You don't see me using spaces or clicking around in my dock, as Don was talking about yesterday. Try to take note of those things as well. Like, again, demonstration of how I'm using my tools, but also how I'm doing the approach, both things, right? So you see me doing this, right? Not saying this is the only way, but in my opinion, it's the fastest way. And so it's a good, my hands are always resting on Command-Tab if it's a Mac. Literally, that is my resting, because I'm constantly context switching, right? So that tabs between, in Sublime, for example. So if I had another tab open, like that, right? Yeah. So that is, it's actually muscle memory, so I actually have to think about what I click. Command, Option, left, right, in my case. Or Command, Option, square bracket, I think?
Yeah, I think that John was showing, usually like Command, Shift, something with those. I do the same thing, Command, Option, and then the side arrow.
Yeah, so it depends. I think there's a couple options. I guess the short answer is Google it. Because there's, okay, cool.
You can also think Command Option and then press the numbers pop-up, at least in Chrome, it will go to the various numbers.
Yeah, I never got into the habit of using numbers, but yeah, absolutely you can use the numbers as well for, I use that in Chrome more, like first versus last is Command 1 and Command, so like, oh, it shouldn't be opening up my calendar like that. But like, let's say I have a bunch of tabs, Command 1, Command 9, right? First and last.
Yeah.
Command 8 would be not existent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 9 is also the last one. I don't know. There's a bunch of things like that. I'm not, again, it's not about teaching you these tricks specifically, like what is the shortcut of doing this. It's more, see me do it, write down a note, right? Like, I want to discover how to do this, and then go ahead and Google that particular trick. Oh, which brings me to another point I forgot to mention. In lecture, I do not expect you to follow along the code with me. Don't do that. It's actually I mean, I can't force you not to do that. My advice is don't do that. Instead, write notes on what's happening. I will send out the lecture notes with the code as well as some of the other stuff we talked about as well. So there's a lot of digressions that I go into or lectures go into. That's the stuff you want to be writing down, or keywords or to-dos for yourself after lecture. Those are the things that I suggest you write down as notes. Don't follow along on the code, in my opinion. OK, digressions aside, we've solved this particular error, we think. What do you think will happen now if I try to run the thing that I was trying to run? What's my hypothesis now? I'll get a blank output, no error message. It will run the file successfully because it is a valid JavaScript file. An empty file is a valid JavaScript file. That is correct. Cool. So that's my first step. And that was the trick question that I was talking about earlier, about what's the first thing to do. So with that file created, I'm going to use Command T or Command P, same thing, to open up some.js in the same directory that I have open in Sublime. And so I have that file open. I have not used the trackpad at all in doing that. What's next? Now it's getting a little bit harder, because now I'm going to start writing code. I guess I should paste the thing that I had. I know it's a bit gray on black, so I apologize. But this is a comment that just rephrases the problem, which is the summing problem, in case you needed a reminder. So what's my next step? Getting my set of numbers, figure out my input. So I guess there's going to be some kind of variable that holds this data, right? Like I'm thinking really short term here. I could have still done the pseudocode, right? I'm skipping that step. You can do that first if you want, right? But I'm doing both the pseudocode, so the solution implementation, and the code writing, all incrementally, as showing you an alternative. You could use that alternative completely, or you could do pseudocode and then do this approach. I'm totally open to both, right? So working incrementally then and coming up with the logic incrementally, I need a variable with numbers. And I'm working with error-driven development, right? So I'm actually going to like just see what is the value of that array, right? What Clive was speaking to earlier, which is just look at the value. The easiest way in a terminal is just console log it. This is my array. Right, let's just call it that. Or it could be called input. Give it a reasonable name, right? Notice that I didn't declare the variable, that I'm expecting it to exist, right? Again, I'm focusing on what I want to be able to do, and then I'm going to implement it to actually work, because hopefully, like, this is not a solution, right? What do we hypothesize will happen here?
Numbers has not been declared.
Yeah, there's a expectation that numbers exists. Yeah. It's a keyword. I'm not using a string here, right? This is not data. This is referencing data. And so it's referencing a variable that points to data which doesn't exist right now. So if I run this, the assumption is some kind of, I'm just going to clear the screen here, bad habit. Command K is what I use there to clear the screen. It's a bad habit because I can't scroll up and see the history. So you have to really be conscious about doing that. I have a subconscious kind of like, I just hit Command K all the time to have an empty terminal. But sometimes I regret it because it's like, oh, I needed to see that output. Ah, crap. So keep that in mind. Again, I'm giving you Mac shortcuts. You can find the alternative on your Linux or Windows machines. So I'm going to run this. And I'm going to expect an error as, I forgot your name already. Shmoo. As Shmoo mentioned, I'm terrible with names, by the way. I'm going to expect an error saying numbers is not defined or something of that nature. Indeed, that's the error that I see. What's the benefit that if I already know what the error is going to be, what's the benefit then of still doing incremental error-driven development?
You're not making assumptions.
I'm not making assumptions. Don't trust yourself. Don't trust any code that you write, right? We're constantly going to be making mistakes. And so to that end, fine, but I can still write 10 lines of code and then run it and still not trust myself. So why work so granularly? Yep.
Every time you make that mistake in the future,
Every time you make that mistake in the future, you'll know how to fix it. So you're getting comfortable with that error message specifically. But I asked the question, what if you're already comfortable with that error message? Then why work? Then is there still a reason to work incrementally and deliberately cause the error message that you already knew, in this case, Shmoo knew what the error message was going to be exactly? Yeah. Having control of the situation, absolutely. Because if it doesn't do that, then since you've been working incrementally previously, you kind of know the scope of what you need to fix. It could still be that the scope of what you need to fix isn't what you just did recently. It could still be like an error that you caused earlier that's now surfacing, but the chances of that are reduced because you're working so incrementally. So numbers is not defined is the situation that we're in. What are we going to do? How are we going to solve this problem? Define the thing. Can somebody help me, tell me, to what extent am I defining this? So am I just saying numbers equal something? Var, number, empty square brackets. I would argue to solve this error, I don't even need an array, right? I'm just solving the error and nothing more. So all I need to do is make that error go away, and then I could be moving on to the next error. So my hypothesis could be now I have another error, but it's what am I solving right now is just the error that's in front of me. So I think var numbers is enough. So now that variable is defined. And now what is my hypothesis about what the next error or problem or non-problem solution will be? So numbers is now a thing. It is defined, but the value of it is undefined, which is kind of confusing because you just said number is not defined. So not defined and undefined are two different things. So the variable has been defined, but its value is undefined, right? And so we should see the console log undefined. Great. Now, this is stuff you already know. So you're like, you may be going, I already know this stuff. But again, I'm focusing on the approach of how to use the stuff you already know to your advantage, right? Cool beans. So we've got undefined output. Great hypothesis, correct? And by the way, it's OK to be incorrect in your hypothesis, right? You learn something new. Now what?
Well, the new problem is that numbers is undefined, so we need to give some value to numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So a problem we have now is, it's not an error, but it's still an error in a way. It's not an error message, but it's still an error, is that we don't have our expected behavior, which is we want to be able to see an array of numbers. And you talked about edge cases earlier, but let's just go with the happy path of numbers. Okay. Because we're working incrementally here, right? So edge cases force us to think about too many things and kind of take us away from incremental, unless we've already done the happy path and now we're ready to think about edge cases. So would I just go ahead and define an array here? No, an array is not undefined. An array is, now the value is defined and it's no longer empty or undefined, it's an array. It's an empty array, but it's very different than undefined. So if I do this, my hypothesis is it will output an empty array, not the value undefined. Just learned something that you wouldn't have necessarily learned if you went straight to the solution, right? I'm just going to clear the screen. Hopefully that's OK with people. Let me know if it's too small or anything like that. You know what? It is too small. There we go. You OK in the back? Able to see? Cool. This is my awkward pause that I was talking about. Think about what we're doing next. I'm not going to pick on people just yet. I want to see how many hands go up. OK. Just one hand so far? Anything? Anything from Victoria? What's next? Remind me your name? Moshe. Go ahead. Add numbers? Add something else? What do you mean? Oh, add numbers into the array. Yeah, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Other solutions? I want to hear some more ideas before I pick one, I guess, that resonates with me. Yeah. Populate the array, put some numbers into the array. But the array is supposed to get populated not by me, but by the user, right? So the user is supposed to put in numbers. But you're saying I should just put in numbers myself? So you want me to hard code numbers in here? That's bad, you're saying? Tony's saying no, don't do that. So by the way, I noticed with lecture, so the tone in which I ask questions can insinuate the answer. So I asked that question in a way that sounded like it was the wrong answer, but I trick you sometimes. I do that deliberately just to throw you off a little bit and make you think, instead of just using my tone as the like, well, that must mean the answer is I nod my head this way versus that way. So this might be a good solution. Populate using process.argv is one approach, because that's potentially what I want. I want it to come from the argument vector that that node gives me, which is what the user types in, right? So that's probably the solution I'm going towards. But is that a good incremental step is the question I want to ask. Right? I think it's open. I think there's no right answer here, but it's worth a discussion. Yeah.
Populate the numbers because that you're in an error, right? Where the use the input value, but you're using numbers.
So populating it is actually not in the direction, is not the solution.
Yeah.
And therefore the error is that you populated it, and so that's okay. Because we're doing error-driven development. That's your point?
Yeah.
It's a fair point. It's a fair argument. Not the strongest argument for doing populating, but I see that you're like, hey, it's the ethos of error-driven development, right?
Yeah.
Fair.
Would putting some numbers in just kind of like you just need to work with something to write them. You can worry about the arguments coming in later. Like you just want to make sure that our code is actually working on itself.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is the approach I would take. I would actually put in the numbers hard-coded, as the word is, one of the words is, to describe what I just did here. Instead of them being dynamic values, I've statically typed them in. They're always going to be 1, 2, 3 when my program runs, which is not the intended behavior of my application. And this is actually a really important point that I like to make in this when I have my first lecture of this kind, is we're also trained by society and our education that when we were trying to get from a problem, from lack of a solution to a solution, that the best path to the solution is a straight line, right? Incrementally work towards the solution. I wish I had a whiteboard in front of me. I do, but I'm too lazy to go grab it. But essentially what I'd be driving on that whiteboard is point here, point there, and a line, which is what we are indirectly always trying to do and probably did yesterday as much as possible. I'm going to actually argue that that's not the path to the fastest, best solution. My argument is actually that the path is more zigzagged. So sometimes you actually go a little bit away from the solution, and then again a little bit away from the solution, but you're still heading towards the path of the solution, but you're writing code that you're rightly going to throw away or change, and you know that you're doing that. Console log is a great example. You're not going to end up with a whole bunch of console logs in your code by the end when you submit it for review or for release to the wild. But as you work, you're writing code that you're throwing away, so you're actually like not going directly towards the solution, right? Every character that you write in that file isn't towards the solution. It's towards helping you to the next step. Why do you think sometimes going zigzag, which seems like you're writing more characters, doing more work that you're throwing away, is a faster path to the solution oftentimes? Yeah, so exactly. If you write a whole bunch of stuff, again, that incremental development argument, right? If you write a whole bunch of stuff that's directly in the path of the solution, or even if you're doing that incrementally, but if you're not writing some support code to verify what you're doing that may take you a little bit outside of that solution, then you are just potentially setting yourself up for harder debugging, right? And so this is an example of that where even though this is not my solution, this is potentially a good next step. It's kind of going a little bit away from the solution, right? Even though I could use process argv right now, I'm not going to. This is easier for me to deal with right now. Why is this easier for me to deal with right now compared to process argv? I don't have to deal with arguments in the command line. I don't have to worry about a bunch of potentially edge cases that can come from that I can deal with later. I may not even know how to deal with that in the language that I'm now being asked to implement this in. So now I don't have to go learn that thing as I try to implement some of the solution, right? This is a trivial example of that, and you already know process argv. So even better that we're doing it this way so that you can appreciate that, there's that kind of, you don't have to use all of the things that you know. You can just put placeholders like this until you get to that point that you're like, okay, now it makes sense to put in those dynamic values. Okay. So I just added stuff. My hypothesis is that when I run this, not necessarily an error, but my hypothesis is that I'll see the values now because I'm console logging. Now you might be thinking, holy shit, KB, you just wrote 2 lines of code and it took you half hour. And the code was stuff that I could write before I even took the prep course. So I hope you're not too frustrated by that. How many people appreciate what I've done so far? I mean, maybe you're under pressure to say yes, I don't know. I'll still take it. Let's go further. What's next? Convert that array somehow into a number because we want the output to be a final number that is the sum of these items for sure. How do I work incrementally towards that in an error-driven way? Yeah, that's a good point. So like maybe I have a function that I'm going to expect to have that will take in as input these numbers, and I'm going to actually just like console log that and see that that's going to fail. So console log, I don't know why I can't type, sum as just my like, I like to label my output because if I have a lot of console log like Clive was talking about, then I'm going to forget what's outputting which line. And then I'm going to, as the second part of that console log, actually try to see what the sum is. So sum, wow, it's actually stopped working. No, that's not good. There we go. My keyboard is a little bit wonky. It has been from day one. I've just been too lazy to take it into Apple. These new keyboards suck. So I'm going to call sum, and I'm going to pass in the numbers. Right? And I expect that to not work. And I expect an error of like function is not defined or something like that. Right? And so my next step is to try and fix that error and only that error. So somewhere up above here, I guess, I'm going to define a function called sum to solve that error. This is the least amount of code that I can write to define a function. I know that I should be taking in an argument, right? But in terms of solving that error, I don't need to be writing that argument thing. So again, I'm being very dogmatic about solve the error. And just like when you learn to drive, they teach you learn to drive like when you stop at a stop sign, you stop for 2 seconds, you look left, you look right, you look right, you look left, and then you go, right? But as you become proficient with driving, you start to kind of cheat that system a little bit, right? This is the same thing here. I'm teaching you very dogmatic, and then you can decide how much leeway you want to give yourself. Yeah, do you have a question or a statement? Did you raise your hand? Someone raise your hand? Yeah, Clive?
Yeah, just a question about declaring functions. So is it best practice to be declaring a variable for a function rather than just declaring a function like that?
So in terms of style guide, there are different opinions on how you define a function. Certain style guides will say that you should define it using variables all the time. So you use var sum equals function. And then you could decide to give that function no name because you've given the variable a name. But actually, other style guides will say, no, both of them have to have a name. So it'll be like something like that. Which I don't generally practice. But like if you look at the Airbnb JavaScript style guide as an example, which is a very popular style guide for how they do JavaScript and how they recommend other people use it, since there's so many options, they recommend doing it this way. I won't get into the why of that. You can Google that later if you like, or talk to a mentor about that, or future lecture. Is that cool? I don't think there's anything wrong, at least in week 1, with doing it this way for now. Just like we're using var now, come week 2, you're not going to be using var, right? So we're going to slowly take away some of the things, but you'll appreciate why we're taking them away versus just take things for granted. Okay, so we've defined the function. And so now my assumption now when I run this is that that error will have gone away. And what? Oh, sorry, yeah. It's going to be called sum. So with this change, what's going to be the output? Probably blank.
Yeah, it's going to say sum colon space and then blank because there's nothing in the function.
Sum colon space and then blank because there's nothing in the function. So this is good. We're not sure, right? It sounds like you guys are guessing, which is good. Any other guesses? It could be undefined. Why? Okay, there's nothing there, therefore that's undefined. Sure. The function is defined, but it's not returning anything that's defined. So that's a fair guess. Yep. 1, 2, 3 will show up. We're not, oh, so yeah, 1, 2, 3 will show up, you're right, because this console log right here. But it won't show up because of this one, right? It won't say sum colon 1, 2, 3. Because in nowhere are we trying to console log the value again. We're console logging the return value of sum. So what sum executes. So we're going to have to look at what has happened when it goes to line 8. Nothing. So undefined or empty value or something like that. Those seem like good guesses. Let's run it. Undefined. So we've just learned something without having to read any documentation about JavaScript. We've learned two things, actually. What are the two things that we've learned? One is this undefined thing. Specifically, I'll answer that one. A function that doesn't do anything, it doesn't return anything explicitly, it returns undefined. We just learned that through inference, right? Through deduction. What is the other thing we just learned about JavaScript specifically? No, sorry, in this step specifically, what did we learn by defining a function this way and running it? That was the previous step that you're talking about. Yeah, like JavaScript's really loosey-goosey with this shit, you know? Like, other languages will be like, what are you doing? But JavaScript's like, yeah, it's cool. And that can burn you, but it's a thing that you may not know, and maybe you learned that now, or maybe you already knew that, but it's reaffirming the fact that you don't need to pass in arguments or accept arguments. JavaScript allows you to do either or.
So basically, because it didn't give us an error, then we know that it did.
Because it didn't complain or even give a warning, let alone an error, it doesn't seem to care. Okay, what's a potential next step? Yep.
We have to give the function something to give us. We have to return something.
The function can return something. Yeah, so the function could just return 20.
Sure.
Right? Like, have it return a sum. But that's not again, it's not going towards our solution. No. It's going kind of orthogonal to our solution, but at the same time helps us kind of feel more comfortable with what we think should happen. Right? You might want to take this step. It's up to you. I expect to see 20 now. So I know that the sum should be, there should be a number that should be returned, and we are successfully outputting it. Right? Okay? However, I'm going to probably quickly change that to the next step, which is what?
Defining how sum looks like, so adding two numbers.
Adding two numbers?
Yeah. Or adding the numbers.
Oh yeah, so like, yeah, like it could be like 20 plus 20 sort of thing. Yeah. Adding two statically typed numbers, not dynamic. So that would be 40, absolutely. That's a good next step. I like that. Yep.
Maybe putting the parameter in so that even though we didn't get an error there, but we know that we're going to want to add a parameter.
Yeah, it's not an error, but we know there's a missing thing that we need. So we're going to need, that's our next step, is we feel that we're missing the argument input. Can I work without the argument input? Can it not take in arguments and still sum those numbers up? No. No is the answer here.
Oh, and
yeah, so JavaScript, it depends on the language. In JavaScript case, we have outer scope access. And so we can actually reference the outer scope. It's not generally considered good practice, but we could do that if we want and say that sum will actually expect there to be a variable in the outer scope called numbers. Don't rename it because sum will break. And therefore, you can kind of loop through numbers. But we're not going to do that because of what I just said. Bad practice. Can somebody repeat what the bad practice is or why it's bad practice? It makes your function a lot less flexible. Why?
Hard, what did you say, hard program?
Hard code?
Hard code, yeah, the numbers every time is more.
Yeah, it's now coupling sum with its outer scope.
Yeah.
It's now saying sum expects the outer scope to have a variable named numbers. So if you were to document this, what this function does, it would be something like expects a variable to be predefined called numbers. Like that seems ridiculous. Why not just take in the numbers, right? So instead it should be expects an input of numbers, and it doesn't care what you call them in the outer scope as long as you just pass in an array of numbers.
There's a typo there for expect.
Oh yeah, you'll see a lot of those. This is the benefits of live programming, right? Thanks for catching that for me. So yeah, so now I want to actually take in the thing, so I'm going to write numbers here, right? Creating a loop to lump sum, we're very close to that. Yeah, so absolutely. But before we get there, is this a good step? Numbers? Yeah, the variables are named the same thing, and that can actually lead to confusion. In fact, now you have no option. Now if you refer to the word numbers, you're referring to the local variable numbers that you've defined. And even though it's bad practice, you can't access that outside scope anymore. Right? So you've essentially overshadowed the outside scope by using the same name. So we want to avoid that. Yeah, maybe give it relevant names, right? This is where naming is an important thing, and one of the phrases is there's two things that are very hard in computer science or programming. One of them is naming things. The other is often changed, like what the other one is, as like part of the joke. But like one of them is everybody agrees like naming things is one of the hardest things to do. So what are we going to name these different variables? We actually have, yeah, so this parameter is a local variable. We haven't called it var numbers, but implicitly it's var numbers inside here. So we have two variables now. We have the outside var numbers and the inside var numbers. We want to rename one of them. So should this one be input then? I would argue it should be the opposite. Can you see why? Because it's context specific, right? To the function sum, it's not input. I mean, everything's an input. But it can give it a more specific name because it's expecting numbers because its job is to sum numbers. But to the program, which is going to take this as user input, you can call that input. Because you don't know if those are numbers or not. You're expecting them to be, but you can call it like maybe numbers, or you can call it input, or user input, or something like that. So I would argue that this should be input. And you pass in input to sum. But sum has more expectations around what that thing is. It's expecting it to be numbers. And of course, it may have to do some magic to make sure that they're numbers. But it's a little bit more deliberate when I'm reading this code what this function's intention is. It's summing a bunch of numbers. Yeah. Right? And I just refactored code, by the way, without saying specifically. Right? I didn't change any behavior, but I refactored it because I found a better way to name things. And so what's my next step? To run it, just to make sure that I haven't broken anything. Is this valuable? Am I going too slow for people here? Is this okay? Yeah? You were going to say something?
I feel it's a little incremental for like, I'm kind of like, okay, I know,
Okay, great.
I can
Great.
figure out the function, but
So let's go a little bit faster. We're at 10:30 anyway. Absolutely, sorry to interrupt. So let's go a little bit faster, but still appreciating the incremental approach. Hopefully Victoria's feeling okay. Okay. So with that said, we've got our function. What's next? Yeah, we can make a loop for the array. Now, error-driven development, we talked about creating an error first, but it's kind of challenging at this point to be like, what is my error? I guess my error is that like I'm not summing the numbers, not necessarily an error message on the console, right? So that is still a valid thing that you're solving. It doesn't mean that you have to always see the error message, right? So in this case, we're creating a for loop. So for, oh, come on, open bracket, var I for index equals 0, I is less than numbers dot length, I plus plus or I plus equals 1, right? So three different clauses as part of my for statement. The initial value and variable, the while condition, so while this is true, keep going, and the incremental value, right? What's next? Remember, I'm working incrementally, so what's next? I should just run that, but unfortunately if I run this, I know I'm not going to see any output. So probably the least amount of code I can write to validate what I've written is correct. Exactly, console log I. Sorry, my expectation was to see 0 to the length, or length minus 1. So in this case, 0, 1, 2. Right? And it's also, interestingly, returning undefined because I'm not explicitly returning anything right now. Okay, next step. My error is that instead of seeing the numbers in my console log, I'm seeing the index. So I'm going to now console log the number in the array versus the index. Is that a fair next step? So maybe just to be explicit, something like that, right? So now I have the i's as well as the numbers. What's next? I need to start summing these numbers. So again, I could go ahead and create that variable called total or sum or something like that, and start with that. But error-driven development, I would argue, you actually cause that error, right? So what would that error be? Well, trying to sum to something that doesn't exist, maybe, right? So total plus equals number. Right? What do you think the error will be here? Total is not defined? That's a fair guess, right? Because we haven't defined total. That makes sense. Good hypothesis. And so my next step is to define total. Right? Just define it. I should be initializing it as 0, but just for illustration purposes, we've just gone ahead and defined it. What is my hypothesis for what's going to happen next? What's the next problem or error that I'm going to encounter? Yeah, so it's like total is undefined, and plus equals means total equals total plus num. That's what plus equals is, right? So I'm doing, total exists, so that's good as a variable. So won't complain that it's not defined. But then the left-hand value on the sum is going to be undefined. So I'm doing undefined plus 0. And this is another tactic I want to bring in. In this case, it's very simple for us to validate, or if we're not sure what will happen, we can just run this code and see what happens. But sometimes, it's not as simple as that. You have to do a whole bunch of stuff to get to this line of code, and it's just too much work to be able to repeat and see what the error is. In which case, I encourage you to maybe open up a sandbox environment and actually try out to see what your hypothesis should be. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing undefined plus 0. And so I'm just going to run that expression in Node, in the REPL, and just see what happens. So now I know that, and then so the next loop, I'm going to have not a number in total, and then I'm going to do plus something, right? And it may not be 0, it might be some other number. So not a number plus a number, still not a number. So I'm essentially, my total is going to be not a number. No error message. At least that's how JavaScript behaves. So, whoops. So node. I didn't see not a number anywhere because I never returned it. So I need to fix that error next, right? Stepped outside the problem, experimented, was able to form a better hypothesis. What's next? Initialize it to 0. And we've got, again, I would have a hypothesis, but we're going a little bit faster here. So I see that my final value seems to be working, right? So I've got my happy path working, even though it's not the full solution because it's supposed to take in command line arguments. So I'm still not fully there yet. What could be a next step for me? Should I move to the process argv? I don't think I need this console log anymore, right? That's probably get rid of that. I don't think I need, well, I can still keep this one because I'm probably going to manipulate this, right? So sorry, you were saying something? Put something that's not a number in the array. Yeah, so what happens if there's like, something like that? Or even just a string like this, right? Let's see what happens. What's our hypothesis? We're causing an error, right? I don't mean causing an error message, but causing some unexpected behavior. What is that behavior going to be? Not a number. Not a number? We don't know for sure. So again, you could set into that REPL and just try it out. right? Instead of guessing. But guessing is okay because here we know it's very quick to test, right? We just have to run the file again. So we have different hypotheses here. One is like you get a concatenated string with KV at the end. One is that you'll get not a number. Who knows? It's up to JavaScript and the language. In this case, we see that it took the last sum that it had, treated it like a string, and concatenated KV to it. So that tells us that we learned something new. If you have a number plus a string, you get concatenation happening, and vice versa. Okay, and then of course we have negative numbers, right? Or zeros. Those should be supported. Oops. So I think that works. Probably the better way to try that is like something like this. Yep, that seems to work. What's next? Switch to process argv maybe? Or something else. Or maybe the fact that we have these, we can't handle this situation.
Exactly.
Now you know that intrinsically because you know that process argv is going to be a bunch of strings, isn't it? So maybe that foresight gives you that like, okay, maybe my next step is actually to handle these string numbers because I know I'm going to have to be dealing with that because user input's going to be in string format, right? So that's fair. What's my solution to that? What's a potential solution? So let me bring the error again. We'll use a bigger number to see the error. And what's going to be a solution to that? See a bunch of hands go up? Yep, you.
Converting the string into a number.
Mm-hmm.
So that it can treat it as a number.
Convert the string to a number. If I'm not sure how to do that, I would go ahead at that point and what would I type into Google? Ah, yeah, JavaScript. I noticed that you first forgot that, and that's the gotcha there. Convert string to number. Now you're assuming language, and there's a lot of languages here. So you want to say, should you say Node or JavaScript? Because here's a language-specific question, but in some cases, Node is a better thing to put in, depending on the thing you're trying to query. And right now, it's probably too conflated, like which is which, right? Like, I don't know really the difference between Node and JavaScript. They're kind of the same to me. But as you become more comfortable with like later weeks, you'll be able to tell the difference between when to put Node into Google versus JavaScript. In most cases, whichever one you put will still get you to the solution. But sometimes it'll help like rank the stuff better on Google, right? And so it seems that like, thanks to Google, I get to see even some like AI at work here where it's giving me some potential answers even without having to click anywhere. So the world is changing rapidly around us and we can't do anything about it. But what's a good next step? There's a whole bunch of options here. Parse int seems to be one. Converts a string into a number, a whole number. There's number. There's parse float. We didn't even think about floats. Like what about decimal numbers, right? We need to be able to handle those as well. Didn't say, or does the problem say whole numbers? No. Yep.
I mean, I would click on the link and actually read a little bit more on each one of those.
Why not, right? Absolutely. We don't have time for that, but that's a good next step. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe pick one. But yeah, the assumption is that you'll go ahead and read a little bit, do a little bit of investigative work with what's the difference and which one makes sense for you. Does anybody know which one I ought to pick?
Yeah, I pick number.
Pick number? Yeah, that's a good answer. So we can just cast or change the type of that value using that capitalized function, correct? Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Why not test that in the sandbox? Sorry, that's a good step. So we'll just do, we know the sandbox will automatically output the last expression, so we don't have to like var and console log it. Its console log is implied. So number, interesting. Test the decimal version. Okay, that works. Test the negative version. That works. What else should I be testing? String of letters. Ooh, I'm going to end up with not a number, which is not an error, but I need to handle that case. And anything else? What else can the user input? Empty string, perhaps? Interesting. What else? Could be a number followed by a letter. Different languages handle this differently. Ruby will return 55 here. It will just ignore the A. JavaScript will say that's not a number. So again, language-specific behavior. Right. So then you'll have to add some logic here, again in an incremental fashion, to handle the not a number situation as well by causing it at first, and then by solving it thereafter. But I'm not going to do that because I'm out of time. And I think I've kind of achieved my goal, which is very much focusing on the approach, not really getting to the solution as much. Right? There's more work to be done to get a solution. I don't care. Right? You could do that as stretch for yourself as you get the code after, or you could even take it further and perhaps add some more functionality to this app in a error-driven approach, or the assignments that you have left over from yesterday or that you're going to work on today. I'd like you to try that out. I'd like you to try out this approach. It doesn't have to be 100% of the time or in the exact same way that I did, but I'm going to ask you when I do a lecture again later this week, I think I have a lecture with you, or whenever I have my lecture with you next, I'm going to ask how that went and if that was a good approach for you, if it worked in terms of helping you debug and learn faster. Cool beans? Any questions or comments or thoughts before I adjourn? What is sandbox is a good question by Gabe. So sandbox is just a generic term for somewhere where you're not in your entire app and having to run all the code in order to test out a specific thing that you're going to use in that code. So sometimes it's actually easier to step away from your code or project. This will be especially noticeable in week 2, but even usable right now, where you can step away from this, open up a sandbox environment like the Node REPL, REPL being REPL, read, eval, print, loop. I think you were introduced to that formally yesterday. And that allows you to quickly experiment with expressions to learn more about the language or some behavior about something, some library or something like that. And you'll see instructors do that just because it's our habit to do that. It's not like we have to force ourselves to do that. So it's a good thing for us to demo and for you to kind of pick up on and hopefully practice as you go along. Yep.
I got stuck in Node yesterday without knowing what I did, and I just saw using period exit. Is that how you get back into your...
Yeah, so Control C is generally the sends a kill signal to whatever thing you're in. Let's say you're in an infinite loop in Node by accident. You've done a for loop that doesn't exit. Control C is the, it sends a signal called kill, or terminate.
Like close command,
Yeah.
open it to that.
And it gives you a warning and all that shit. Yeah. So Control C tells you to do it again. That little, this is Control C again, or type exit. Yeah, no problem. But a great thing to Google, right? And be able to solve that way too.
Yeah, I didn't even know what happened.
By the way, another thing I should mention about my lecture style, I answer questions like that in week 1, but in week 2 I'll become a little bit more, that's the question you should Google, right? And so that's just more of shifting your mindset in terms of what ought to be the focus of lecture versus that you can do independently. Not to demean your, not to belittle your question, but just, yeah.
I wouldn't even know how to Google because I didn't know how I got to that.
Right, fair point. Fair point. Any other questions or statements? Was this useful? Do you feel excited about trying out error-driven development that I've conjured as a term? Yeah. Give it a shot. I'm not going to force you to use it, but do try it out and try it to whatever degree makes sense to you. Other takeaways from lecture? Let's summarize them really quickly. Other takeaways before we adjourn? Say that again?
Start with small working programs and then add features on.
So don't get too caught up in additional features or edge cases too early either, right? Is another way of saying that? What else were our takeaways? Yep. That said, don't forget the edge cases, scenarios, before you call your solution complete or, you know, ready to merge, review, whatever, deploy, right? Yeah.
Refactor as you go.
Yeah, refactor as you go. Refactor as you go. In fact, incrementally writing code helps you refactor. Incrementally writing code with error-driven development helps you refactor code because you put your console log statements in there and you kind of know that they shouldn't change, or if you can set those hypotheses pretty easily. Another thing I said, but you haven't really experienced fully yet, is refactoring or mutating code, existing code, like large amounts. And of course, the word large is relative. And so right now, large amount could mean like 30 lines of code to you, but then eventually 300 lines of code or 300 files, right? Like we become better at handling those larger files. But whatever that large definition is for you, that boundary, it's going to be hard to modify that existing code and even understand it. And that's another skill to develop. Sometimes gravitate towards re-solving the problem their own way instead of working with the existing solution. This is a common thing I see in developers who have this challenge, and instead of like saying, okay, I'm going to actually have to like understand all this code and then mutate it, saying, okay, let me just write this again in my own way, in my language that I'm comfortable with, or in the tooling that I'm used to, or in the framework that I'm used to thinking in. It's problematic for companies and teams because if everybody was doing that, you take, the categorical imperative and apply that to like everybody's doing this, you're going to end up with a problem because everybody's just rewriting each other's code all the time, right? So we have to get comfortable looking at code and understanding code, and that's a skill set that will take time to develop, and that's something that is also a focus of lecture. I think it's actually the breakout today is like, how do you deal with existing code? Or maybe it's the lecture tomorrow. So like putting a lot of code up on the screen and trying to read it and make sense of it.
Would you say it's a good idea to build putting the comments in?
So ways of combating that is comments, but comments only take you like 10 or 20% of the way. Commenting itself is another skill that we haven't talked about yet. There's definitely wrong ways, or not best practices for commenting, and some ideal ways to comment. And I definitely see seasoned developers comment wrong. I've seen code that I wrote 5 years ago where I commented wrong. You're in the moment and you make mistakes, right? And it's not just your lines of code that you do wrong. Sometimes your comments are wrong or your test code is wrong. So definitely that's a skill to consciously develop as well. But not really a takeaway from this lecture, but something to put in as a teaser for you in terms of what we're going to be covering as well. We also talked, of course, a lot about philosophy of lectures and stuff, so there were some takeaways there, but I've written them up above. Really just to recap on that, we're going to do our best to focus lectures on approach, stuff like this, stuff like how to comment or how to read code, while also introducing new concepts because we are in this condensed model and we have no choice in that. But really the meat of where you learn things that you're going to retain in terms of knowledge is through practice and hands-on approach with the laptop. That said, I don't think you should be coding along with any instructor unless they explicitly say that's the format that they want to take, which is pretty rare, right? Instead, what you should be doing is writing notes, keywords, a lot of the digressions that may not even be in their own notes that they send out. Those are the things that you should be writing about, or to-dos for yourself. Did we talk about markdown-based note-taking? Okay, so I would like you to use, and this is again an opinion, so I'll disclaimer it saying it's an opinion, it's not necessarily the only way to do things. I would like you to start taking notes in Markdown. This is a Markdown file. See the MD here? It denotes as Markdown to my editor. So I'd like you to maybe have one repo called like notes, lecture notes or something, and then in it you just touch a bunch of files each day, like W1D2 for week 1, day 1, or maybe you create a folder for it.
and then you create a lecture.md or something like that. But either way, have an organization in one repo for all your lecture notes. It can be public on GitHub, and you can push it, and you could use Git to manage it. And take those notes in Markdown. If you're not sure about, how many people here don't know what Markdown is? There was, right? There was. Okay, great. There's a comment you want to make?
Yeah, I just want to ask why.
Yeah, so why Markdown? That's a good question. Does anybody want to help me answer that before I answer it? I have my answer, of course, but why do you think Markdown is a good approach to taking notes, or why am I promoting Markdown as the way to take notes? I've seen better alternatives. I'll tell you it's not the best, so why would I be encouraging it? Yeah. It seems to be the format of choice by developers. There seems to be a convergence towards it for documentation. So for writing text, for README files, for example, you'll see if you go into a library on GitHub, it'll have a README or README.md, which will be using Markdown format. Should I cover? So I don't need to cover Markdown format, right? Like headings and lists and stuff. What is the benefit of Markdown then? What is the value proposition? Presentation without having to write HTML tags. Like, I don't want to write ULLI to create an unordered list with list items in it. Just use how you write text, and the Markdown engine will interpret that to be a unordered list and render that in a nice web page, right? So this is the language of choice for text-heavy content versus format-heavy content. Or when you want to separate format from text. Let's forget about the CSS and the HTML. Let's write the stuff, and then we can decorate it later in terms of how it looks, right? Where else is Markdown used? Does anybody know? Reddit, yeah. I don't comment much on Reddit. I'm more of a lurker. But yeah, absolutely, when I do comment, I'm using stars and stuff like asterisks for bolding and things of that nature. Where else? This is a little bit outside the box. You may not know the answer, but I'm curious. So documentation for libraries and code, Reddit. There's at least one more popular use of Markdown. Check Victoria if they maybe know. Blogging. A lot of blogging engines, specifically ones that are, again, more dev-centric. So when devs are blogging, they'll often use static site generators like Jekyll, which will at least introduce you to. So when we're recommending, our career services team is recommending that you create your own website. We know where you can write, even as you go through bootcamp or thereafter, about your learning journey or about certain concepts, or you're going to want to teach other new learners, and you're creating these blog posts. Yeah, you could do it in WordPress with a WYSIWYG editor where you're highlighting stuff and making it bold, similar to Word. But the tool of choice for developers, of course, as Don was mentioning, is very much keyboard heavy and mouse light. And therefore, Markdown works really well for that. And if you Google Jekyll, or you want to write down Jekyll as a bonus stretch for yourself, it's a static site generator that often developers use to do blogging or create their own personal sites. And the content of that, especially the blog posts, are written in Markdown. And Jekyll is just one of thousands of options that you can use for blogging engines. Okay, so a little bit of extra for you there. So I'll leave it there. Oh yeah, Jekyll, J-E, like the creature. Jekyll like the animal. Actually, I guess that's Jackal the animal, but Jekyll's not spelled that way. There you go, there's the reason, yeah. My popular culture knowledge is very minimal. But yes, so it's pronounced, it's spelled Jekyll, J-E-K-Y-L-L. I knew that, but I forgot. So feel free to Google that. And I'll leave it there. And enjoy your second day and the rest of the week. And I hope to see you later this week. Cheers.